Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to Founder World, Day 2. It is my honor today to present to you and introduce Laura Cozzi. We have a keynote speaker to start the day. Laura is the Chief Energy Modeler at the International Energy Agency. Laura was appointed as Chief Energy Modeler in 2018. She oversees the work on outlook and forecast in energy worldwide and is in charge of the overall consistency of modeling work and resulting messages. She is also the head of the Demand Outlook Division, which has the responsibility to produce the annual World Energy, which is the flagship publication of the agency. She's a world subject matter expert in energy demand, efficiency, power generation, renewable energy, and environmental analysis. She has been with the agency for, I believe, 20 or so years. And the agency is the global authority which provides data, analysis, and solution on all fuels and all technology. The agency is composed of 30 members, member countries, including the United States and the European Western European Community countries, and 8 associated countries. So it's my pleasure to welcome Laura to today's panel.
Thank you very much, Silvia. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be with you this morning. And now what I would like to do in the next 15-20 minutes is to just give you our latest analysis and findings of the World Energy Outlook. What is this? This report is a large group of analysts at the IEA pull together this report every year and gives a bit of a snapshot of where we think the world of energy is going. So clearly this year was a very important one for the reason of the Glasgow meeting that took place just 3 weeks ago. And what we have analyzed is how Glasgow, coming into Glasgow and immediately after Glasgow, because we made an update while Glasgow was happening, what are the implications of the decisions of governments and pledges of governments that were made in the run-up to the meeting and during the meeting? So I would like to start, all of us, putting back our watches 7 years ago when the Paris Agreement was being negotiated in November 2015. So back then, when we were doing analysis of use of fossil fuels, so that are the largest reason of greenhouse gas emissions, our expectations was that the use of fossil fuel was going to grow hand in hand with the economic growth, very much as we have seen since the beginning of the industrialization in the beginning of the 1900s. So if you look, GDP growth, energy growth, CO2 emission growth was really straight line, very much as you see here. And this was our expectation just 7 years ago. Now, if you look at what policies countries around the world have put in place, those is the policies that are already in laws. Already those are changing very much the picture. They would bring CO2 emissions, what you see here, to a stabilization and a gentle decline. So already a very, very important change where we identify 3 main components of these new policies, as I mentioned, but technological change, innovation on renewables and electric vehicles becoming cheaper and cheaper is really changing the way we are doing investment in the energy sector, and is producing a different outlook for the CO2 emissions. Coming out of Glasgow, we are doing even better. And if the promises, such as net zero by 2050 that the United States has put forward, such as the net zero by 2050 that the European Union has put forward, or the Chinese goal of net zero by 2060, of the Indian goal of net zero by 2070 are put in place, this is where we should be heading, which means for the first time in human history, we are actually sitting at the beginning of a decade in which, for the first time, economic growth and CO2 emissions will start to really decouple. Economic growth would continue to go up and CO2 emissions will start actually to go down to eventually reach zero sometimes in the 2070s. Now, what does it mean for the energy sector? For the energy sector, it means that we are sitting in a very, very turbulent time where the fundamentals are really changing. If we were sticking only to the policies that are in law, this decade would very much mirror the same type of world we have seen the last decade. Very strong rebound in oil demand, very strong rebound in gas demand, and exponential growth in solar and wind. But if government really translate into laws what they have been pledging in Glasgow, we will be seeing something rather different. We would be seeing a peak in oil and gas demand this decade. This is the first time our outlook foresees something like that. For the first reason, for what concerns oil markets, after the strong rebound we are seeing this year, we will be seeing very modest growth thereafter for one main reason. The largest segment of oil demand, being passenger vehicles, accounts for around 20% of overall oil use today, is actually starting to go into a permanent decline. This thanks to the big penetration and sales of electric vehicles. In Europe, in China, this is data of September this year, 20% of car sales were EVs. This is basically happening surely and is denting into this largest segment of oil demand. Natural gas, bit more complex story there. To simplify to the bones, basically, we see two different trends by region and by sectors. We will start seeing large advanced economies that have put ambitious goals to go to net zero emission, to start seeing natural gas demand declining within the next 2 to 3 years. This is particularly true for the electricity sector, where the advent of solar and wind, and eventually solar and wind coupled with the batteries, is really taking away the role of natural gas as mid-load and really reducing it for peaking purposes, therefore using much less gas, while we still would have natural gas turbines working and installed. They would be used much less, and therefore the natural gas use would be lower. So this is one part of the story. The other part of the story is emerging economies that they have put net zero target further down the road, where we are expecting natural gas use to continue to grow. The combination of those two would lead to globally a plateau in the mid of this decade. Very little uncertainty around renewables growth is continuing to boom with over 130 countries that are actually installing either solar or wind or both as we are speaking now. If we move to power, and in particular coal, we are witnessing also here a very dramatic change. If you look ahead, we are basically seeing the amount of coal power generation having peaked last decade. And if the end of the support of Chinese coal projects abroad ends, as President Xi Jinping has announced in September, basically this decade, the 2020s, would be the last decade in which we would be seeing new coal being installed. Now, having seen all this, clearly going into a very different direction, the global energy markets. But if we look at what does it mean for a temperature increase, which is the main reason why the Glasgow meeting, Paris meeting are happening, well, announced pledges would lead us to, for the first time, temperature increase below 2 degrees, but a scenario that is fully compliant with net zero by 2050, which means 1.5 degrees, which is the target that we are aiming at, as science tells us, is the safest one in terms of costs, in terms of cost of climate change. Well, you can see here that there remains out of Glasgow a very significant gap of emission reductions that still needs to happen. It's composed of two different things. In the decade to 2030 is really pushing more existing technologies, in particular solar and wind, that would cut further the emissions from coal. In the longer term, what we need is innovation. What we find is that actually 50% of those emission reductions would materialize with technologies that are not in the market yet. The changes in the types of investment we are discussing would also change quite dramatically the trade and the trade commodities in energy as we know it today. Today, oil is by far the largest value in terms of international energy related trade. 2/3 of the value is in long distance oil trade. As we move towards more ambitious scenarios, announced pledges, so what was put forward in Glasgow, we see that the role of oil declines, and you see emerging other elements, in particular two I'd like to bring to your attention: hydrogen and critical minerals. So regardless to the net zero date, so at a certain point globally we will get close to or hit net zero emissions. In that scenario, you see the role of oil becomes much smaller, and you have very, very predominant roles taken by critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, and hydrogen, with other types of hydrogen-related fuels such as ammonia, synthetic fuels, and others that take a much bigger role. So the speed at which this transition will happen is uncertain and depends very much on technology innovation on one hand and policy enforcement on the other, but the trend is very clear: emergence of high value and volume, eventually, commodities that would come next to oil. So if you're following energy markets nowadays, you see that we are living in a very, very turbulent moment, very high oil prices, very high natural gas prices, especially in Europe, very high coal prices, especially in China and India. The combination of a number of factors has brought this boom in prices, but I would like to bring your attention to this chart that shows that basically we find ourselves in the following situation. Oil and gas companies are investing in production of oil and gas, which is fully aligned with the amount of investment that would be needed to meet a fully compliant net zero by 2050 scenario. But if you recall the slide that I showed earlier, in terms of demand, so energy use that we consumers are demanding, that's not in line. So not even the promises made in Glasgow are in line with this type of scenario. So we are actually seeing a big, big gap in what we call clean energy and infrastructure investment. What is this? Is investments by us consumers in energy efficiency, investment in the lowest energy consuming device, is investment in recharging infrastructure for buses, for cars, is investment in hydrogen infrastructure. We're seeing for that a very, very large gap. This mismatch between investment in oil and gas being aligned with a net zero trajectory, but the demand side of the equation not being aligned is provoking this volatility. And if we don't fix this quickly, this volatility of prices is going to persist and last for some time. If we have a look at the broader energy economy, for us, analyzing this year's situation, it's very clear that the new global energy economy is emerging. And what we mean by that is that while we're seeing volatility and signs of uncertainty of transition in certain parts of energy markets, we just mentioned oil, we just mentioned natural gas, we just mentioned coal, there are some indicators that are very, very stubbornly positive and robust. Which are those? Electrification and electricity demand growth. They're all pointing towards very positive growth and very steady growth. Sales in electric vehicles, similarly, I mentioned the numbers for Europe and China just a minute ago, but it's becoming a very global phenomenon. We just released our latest data on renewables, again, breaking records, both for solar and wind. So very strong and continuous growth for renewables. And huge interest all over the world on hydrogen. Consumer producing countries, huge interest. So it's very clear that the direction of the energy transition is set, and there are new clean energy technology markets that were niche and are becoming core. Are becoming so core that our expectation is that basically within the next decade or 15 years, if the transition takes a bit longer, the clean tech space, so which is in this assessment the size of the market, the global market of a selected number of clean energy technology equipment, will overtake the size of oil markets. This is an undeniable sign of a huge transformation that is happening. And if there is anything to underline here, is in fact that we are just selecting a handful of technologies, just 5. There would be more that we could be adding here. Just to mention a couple that come to mind: carbon capture, utilization, and storage. We are expecting that to grow as well. Small and modular reactor equally becoming important, and a lot of digital application that could help demand side response, that could help a number of energy-related applications to equally boom. So very clearly, investors that are looking at these new technology areas and are investing in these new technology areas can take a very important advantage, edge vis-a-vis others. So to conclude, maybe couple of thoughts. Glasgow has been an important turning point, while not necessarily meeting all the in full the expectation of keeping the temperature goal below 1.5 degrees. Never we had seen so many countries announcing, pledging net zero goals. Now 90% of the global economy in terms of emissions has set net zero goals. So this will have implications for the incumbent energy markets, in particular oil and gas, for which we are expecting a peak in demand within this decade. At the same time, we are living in very turbulent energy markets time. Why? Because the investment signals are still a bit confused, and they may remain so for some time to come. What is certain is that we have very clear signs of new energy economy emerging, with a host of new technologies taking firmly number of markets globally, and a need for innovation. I remind that innovation needs new technologies that are not yet in the market would be needed to bridge 50% of the emission gap that we currently have. So innovation has a huge role to play as investment is in all those new technologies. And I will stop here and be happy to take questions if there are any.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Laura. Very, very interesting topic. I don't know if there are live questions. Otherwise, I have a couple of questions on the chat. Maybe we can start. Maybe we can start with the question on the chat. So, in your last slide, you presented a prediction of growth of renewable energies, and one of the things that was noticeable is that battery packs are going. I think it was the red in the histogram is really large compared to solar technology. Can you give us some insights on why is that?
It's a matter of volume. So batteries are going to become very ubiquitous in our lives. For example, batteries part of those will be coupled with solar panels, but only a small part of those. The larger part will actually be used in vehicles for mobility. So there will be very small batteries that will be used in what we call here the trottinette. So the just very small scooters, 2-3-wheelers, but also buses, and then vehicles. So now we are running at around 100 million vehicle sales a year. This is just cars, private cars. You can imagine that that becomes a huge amount of batteries in very small amount of time. So what we are showing there is a billion value. What's happening with the solar market is that it's growing tremendously, and we're expecting that to grow tremendously in volume, but the price of solar modules is going down at the same time very quickly. So there are two factors there that play one against each other. If we had shown volumes itself, just the gigawatts of new installed solar, that would have been growing in an exponential way.
Okay, thank you.
Sylvia, a great question. I was going to ask essentially the same thing myself. And Laura, as a follow-up, I was very curious to ask. Clearly, battery technologies are one of a few technologies that don't trend with Moore's law, and the price per unit has not come down nearly as much as solar or other digital technologies. And I'm curious to ask as well as if you see any emerging technologies on the horizon that will significantly improve the performance of battery technology, because it seems lithium is not an affordable option for many larger applications.
So lithium ion for electric vehicles application has actually come down quite a lot. So I'm quoting here data that I think came out yesterday. We are looking at the 80% reduction over a decade. So it's a pretty significant decline. But it's true, Alex, what you said is very true, that the performance of lithium ion for trucks, larger vans, is not yet where we would want it to be. So what we are seeing is, especially in Japan, but not only, there is quite a large investment happening on solid state batteries. And this is where the hope is that there will be a cost breakthrough, technological breakthrough that could bring battery to be more affordable for larger powertrains. Everything I've seen, nothing really before 2030. So in our analysis, you tend to see battery taking for decarbonization of freight, the shorter distances, shorter than 300 kilometers with smaller trucks, and then you start seeing interest in hydrogen actually for longer distances rather than having other types of batteries. We are clearly following much more closely what's happening with solid state, but it's going to be a bit of a neck to neck, I think. Who brings down the cost first?
Fantastic, thank you.
Okay, any other question from the attendees or panelists? If not, I have a couple of questions. So one question is, who do you see? Who is the leader in terms of nation, if there is one, on really building these new energy technologies? Can you shed some light?
I would say, Silvia, that clearly the United States remains in terms of innovation at the forefront. This is very clear. However, it's also true that depending on the technology you're looking, there are different leaders. So if I take the example of offshore wind, I think that Europe has taken an advantage there and has occupied a larger share of the market. In terms of electric vehicle and batteries, clearly Tesla is a huge example, but when you look at volumes, it's actually the Chinese with BID that have the larger market share. So depending on the technology, there are different leaders actually. And I think it's going to be a very interesting decade as we open the decarbonization for different sectors, industrial sectors, so seeing cement, iron and steel, the heat sector in general, hydrogen is really going to be who invests first and cracks the innovation angle first. That is going to really have a huge price in terms of markets.
Thank you, Laura. I think the last question is something that is, it's the talk of the news these days, and it's related to the carbon economy. Can you share your thoughts on, trends on this carbon economy, especially when it comes to, we hear about big companies starting to buy carbon credits from countries, developing countries, Latin America, Africa, to offset their carbon production. Share your wisdom with us.
Well, there is not much wisdom. At a certain point, you need to go to real zero, meaning that you can buy offsets for a certain period of time. We can open a large debate whether these offsets are real or not. So there are a lot of questions there. But I think for the transition phase, we will be relying on offsets to make the carbon equation right. But the end of the journey is clear. Each of the sector in the economy will have to come to net zero emissions. For us, it's clear that the electricity sector is the one that currently is better equipped to do so, and to do so relatively quickly by 2035 in the US and similarly in Europe. But then the other sectors need to follow. So we will have to, we are buying some time, but the equation is very clear. We need to get to zero for all of the sectors.
Thank you, Laura. Really great to hear from you. We want to thank you again. We had Laura Cozzi,
thank you, Silvia.
Chief Energy Modeler of the International Agency. And